Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction.
And that certainly might be said of the story of Eric Maddox of Sapulpa. He is about to become the world's most famous interrogator. Photojournalist Michael Woods and I went to Houston to ask him a few questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
The capture of Saddam Hussein was an event heard round the world. What we didn't hear was the story behind the capture. As unlikely as it seems, it actually began right here on the running track at La Fortune Park when Eric Maddox, Sapulpa native and newly minted OU grad, heard the voice of God telling him to become an Army Airborne Ranger.
I usually don't tell that story, but it's, you know, people in Oklahoma, they get that. They understand that.
He'd never shot a gun, never jumped out of a plane, and was terrified of heights.
Well, every day at Ranger School, I was like, are you sure? I barely passed.
Eric's next decision was equally as improbable. He signed up to become an Army interrogator.
They said, well, be an interrogator. That's the easiest one. It's 8 weeks of training. You'll never do it. We don't have any prisoners.
Then came 9/11 and the start of the war in Iraq. Within weeks, having never done a single interrogation, Eric found himself in Tikrit, working with one of the most highly trained special forces units in the world, and failing miserably.
The really scary part was when I realized not only had I not done an interrogation, but when I started doing them, they didn't work.
The world would later learn that in the early days of the war, torture was commonly used on Iraqi detainees, particularly at Baghdad's infamous Abu Ghraib prison.
It was unaccepted legally, but expected behind closed doors. It was expected from every level.
But circumstances had thrown Army Staff Sergeant Eric Maddox of Sapulpa into what was considered the backwater of Tikrit, working solo and developing his own technique.
And it's the best thing that happened to me, because then there were no expectations. I could figure out how to get these prisoners to talk without torturing them.
Maddox also discovered a natural ability to take tiny bits of information from hundreds of prisoners and piece them together into a mosaic that ever so slowly revealed the insurgency's hidden battlefield.
And when you have an idea of the battlefield, you understand how to hunt down individuals that can take you to the next step, to the next step, to the next step.
Up until this point, Eric Maddox's biggest accomplishment was helping defeat Jenks in the 1989 playoffs. But the search for Saddam had stalled, and Maddox had a plan.
So I went to the team leader and made a pitch. So I know this sounds crazy, but I think I have a path that I think if we follow this path, might possibly lead us to blacklist #1.
Rather than going after high-profile targets, Maddox was following a web of bodyguards, chauffeurs, and shopkeepers, slowly working his way up the chain of command. But his time in Iraq was drawing to a close. And when the raid finally came that netted his #1 target, one of Saddam's bodyguards, Maddox had only 2 hours to convince him to give up the prize.
And I told him, I said, nobody knows who you are. I've been tracking you down, and no one cares. They're gonna just throw away the key. So when you change your mind, beat on your cell, you better let somebody know. And as I'm driving to the airplane to leave the country, they told me, hey, that prisoner's, what'd you do? He's going crazy. He's beating the heck out of his cell in there.
Maddox got the prisoner to sketch a map detailing Saddam's location, then left the country. Publicly, the Bush administration was eager to credit the CIA for the break that led to the Iraqi dictator. But behind the scenes, everyone from CIA Director Porter Goss to Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld was showering Maddox with praise and medals.
And this is my most prized medal. This is the Legion of Merit, and it was presented to me by the team.
Does it feel even kind of unreal now, even telling it? It's just so dramatic and so incredible to have that role in some historical event like this.
It took me several years to come to the conclusion that I wasn't going to wake up from a dream.
Well, now Eric's story is about to go public, very public. He wrote a book a couple of years ago. Now, you haven't seen it much because a movie studio immediately bought the rights. Robert Pattinson of Twilight fame has signed on to play Eric, and the screenplay is being done by the writer behind Band of Brothers. Shooting begins this August. Meanwhile, Donald Rumsfeld was so eager to keep Eric's services that he established a civilian force of interrogators, hiring Eric as the very first one. His work for the Department of Defense continues to this day.